Our speaker tonight is she's a master's in history.
I don't know if she has
Joann
Thank you.
I'm so happy to see so many people come out on today, which is a very special day for me and my little village in Gettysburg. Because 145 years ago, our beloved President Lincoln rode up Steinwehr Avenue to dedicate a cemetery to soldiers who gave their lives in a terrible battle that took 3 days in and around our little village. As I come into the future and into your town, I know that most of you know the Battle of Gettysburg, that you've heard of the Battle of Gettysburg. You know about General Lee, and you know about General Meade, and you know about all the other generals that came to our town that day. The crossroads, they're often referred to during that battle. But as a civilian who comes from that village, what you don't often hear about is on July 3rd, when the guns stopped and the cannon stopped, and General Lee pulled out, and General Meade pulled out, and the battle was over, the little village of Gettysburg would never, ever be the same again. And those of us who were left behind had some horrible, horrible visions that would stay with us the rest of our lives. Now, we had gotten used to the rumors of the rebels coming across the border from Maryland on raids, mostly for food. They looked for food, money to buy food, and our horses. There were also several incidents in the town prior to the battle where our free colored people, when the Confederates came in, they would just round them up and try to take them back over the borders into Maryland and return them to slavery. For you see, the Fugitive Slave Act was very, very important during that time to the South. And even though they wanted to secede, they felt that they had the right to take these freed slaves back to the plantations. So many of us in the village had hit many of our colored townspeople. The rumors got greater and greater. And eventually, on July the 1st, those rumors were confirmed. We as citizens had taken a lot of what was really important to us. We hid food for ourselves. We got our furniture, things that meant the most to us, out of town on the train to the best of our ability. But we prepared as a citizen group, and we took to our cellars during the battle. And for 3 days, 3 hot days, from morning till night, all we heard were musket fire and cannon. And I don't know in this century if you've ever had the opportunity to hear 500 cannon firing from both sides, Union and Confederate. Well, I think I lost every dish I had in the house. Everything rattled. We had a few windows broken, and you didn't dare venture out onto the streets during the days of those battles. And we had our boys in blue come into the town, and as soon as we thought that the boys had secured our village, well, those rebels came in and pushed our boys back out. And they came into our homes, and they set up sharpshooters in our attics, and we just stayed in the cellar. Well, by and by, it had stopped that day in July. It was eerily quiet. And for the first time in 3 days, we quietly stepped out into the streets. And what we saw, I don't think we would ever forget. There were, roughly, from what we read in the papers later on, about 30,000 men strewn all over a 25-mile area where the battle took place. Some were wounded. Roughly 15,000 of those men were dead. Now the armies, on their way out, if they had a regiment still intact, took the time to bury their dead. And they buried them in shallow ground. They couldn't get deep enough. Those regiments, where there were just a few hands, tried to dig mass graves and put as many bodies into the ground. Because you know, in southern Pennsylvania, in July, it's hot. Sun's very strong. And what we saw were bodies that were bloated, bodies that had died on the first day of the battle, black and bloated, and needed to get into the ground. Our men stayed in the town, but we were no match for that number. But we did the best we can with the help of some of the soldiers. That particular night of July the 3rd, it began to rain early in the evening, and then there were downpour. It was a downpour that night. And many of us felt that that was actually sent by God Almighty himself to try and wash the land of all the blood that surrounded us, in our farm fields, in our water supply. And besides the dead soldiers, there were dead animals. When you went out and you looked into our fields, you saw horses on their side, stiff, as if a little child's toy, a little toy horse, just waiting for someone to push it and stand it up on its legs again. And someone had to bury those as well. But I can't tell you ladies in particular, the stench in my home, windows shut in the middle of July, because we couldn't breathe the air. I would take on my hanky, and I dipped into my peppermint oil, and we really used a lot of camphor oil just to cover our faces. For just to go out, just to take a walk to your neighbors, you could not breathe the air. It wasn't but a few days later, once the telegraphs went out that the battle was over and the generals had departed. When the wires went out, we had flies descend upon Gettysburg. You can just imagine with the decaying flesh that was there. But then what began to descend on us, I think even thicker than those flies, were all the gawkers. We had people coming into Gettysburg who just infiltrated us, and they went around to these poor dead soldiers, and they took from these soldiers. They took their boots. They took pieces of their uniforms, buttons, anything that was left on them, and they took them for souvenirs. I thought that was a dreadful thing for them to do. And then we had a fellow coming out by the name of Brady. And you know, he was the guy who was taking, with his new invention of a photographer, cameras. But what we took exception to was that Mr. Brady disrespected the dead, because people in the town saw him ranging bodies so that he could take a better picture. And he would send them up north, and it went in all the newspapers. We didn't really appreciate that. The town was left pretty much on its own for a good 2-3 weeks with an awful lot of bodies to bury. It took a while for the Sanitary Commission to come in and help us. And besides all of that, we had 33,000 wounded soldiers from both sides. The armies couldn't take them with them, so they were left to us in the town. We opened up our homes. We are church-going people. Well, Sundays were spent at home because our churches turned into hospitals, and they were laying in there like sardines. There wasn't enough hay left in the fields to even try and make these men comfortable. But the worst part of it for me was at night when it was quiet. You could hear the moans. You could hear the moans of the soldiers that our surgeons really couldn't do much for. So they were left there to die. And we, as the ladies in the town, did our best to become nurses and tried to take care of them, until such time that our train was up and running into Gettysburg, so that their loved ones then could come in. And once they started to come in, there wasn't a space left in Gettysburg for people to stay. Our hotel was wall-to-wall men. We tried to take in some of the ladies, some of the mothers. These are grieving, sorrowful people. They're looking for their loved ones. And the biggest problem we had was, how would I know my son, my husband? How would I know them once they're in the ground? Some of the regimental commanders were actually putting wooden name tags on their soldiers and put them in the ground, thinking that the wood in the pencil mark would at least last, so that when that loved one came and they could dig up that shallow grave, they would know for sure that that was their loved one. Now, our townsfolk and our leaders in our community, and there's an attorney in town, David Wells, he saw the problem is that a lot of our leaders, we needed to do something. So we contacted Governor Curtin. And Governor Curtin at the time was very concerned about the situation in Gettysburg. And what we were able to do, with the help of the Sanitary Commission, the United States government agreed to provide pine coffins so that these soldiers could have a proper burial. Now, in my day, not everyone couldn't afford what they would call an embalmer. Some families would send one down, and if he was lucky enough to find the loved one, he would embalm them, put them in the coffin, and send them on home. But many of these soldiers, both our Union boys in blue and the rebels that came over that border, no one was coming to get them. And they could not stay in the ground, even in shallow graves. Because during the battle, our fencing was destroyed. And we had animals, and the hogs in particular. They like to root, and they like to dig up the ground. So we had a terrible time trying to keep the hogs from digging up and consuming those soldiers in the ground. It was not easy. The job seemed to find to some of the poorer folk in town, and I believe they got paid $0.25 a day, and some of our colored folks actually were left the responsibility to dig up these boys. It took until September to get most of those bodies in the ground. We had to get our food from other villages around us. And an odd source of help for us came from Maryland. There was a convent in Maryland, and the nuns, who seemed quite strange to us, we never quite understood that, they came over and they saw to it, and they brought food for the town. They brought food for the wounded, and they nursed. And we were all amazed because they really knew how to nurse. They took very good care of the boys. It didn't take long after that, Mr. Wells decided that we needed to do something more than just provide them with coffins. There is a lovely piece of ground just above the village, and Mr. Wells proposed that we put a cemetery there for all those boys, both the Union and the Confederate, to be buried there. He talked to the governor. Eventually, he got permission. The land was purchased. Mr. Wells wasn't sure, but he thought that it would be good for the country, good for our town, if he wrote a letter to our president asking him to come to say a few words. So he dispatched that letter. He never expected that Mr. Lincoln said, yes, I will. And so he did. We did the best we could to prepare for a presidential visit. We were still trying to rebuild ourselves from the cannon holes in our buildings, the musket ball holes in our buildings, our fences down. But we did the best we could. We had a lovely town, a lovely town square, and a lovely hotel there, and that's where Mr. Lincoln stayed. He stayed in a building there. And that morning, he got up, and the weather was cold, and it was very rainy. And all the people that were in the town, all the people that came from other places into the town, numbered about between 10 and 12,000 people were there to hear what Mr. Lincoln had to say. And I must say, Mr. Lincoln was a very tall man, and our horses weren't the best, what few we had left. So we got Mr. Lincoln's horse. Wasn't a very big horse, but it suited the purpose. And Mr. Lincoln sat on that horse. And as I recall him going by, he seemed so brokenhearted. He just gazed at the land, at the devastation. The farms were gone, where the bodies had laid. There was much for him to take in, and it was a slow ride. But just as he was coming up Steinway Avenue, there was a bit of a ray of sunshine that came out as he rode up to that hill. And as you all know, we had a fellow there who spoke before Mr. Lincoln. My feet are still sore. He spoke for 2 hours. 2 hours. Could barely hear him myself because I was way back in the crowd. And then Mr. Lincoln took the stage. And in a very short time, he gave a marvelous speech. In our time, it was considered a marvelous speech. And from what I hear, by this century that you're in, it is a very well-known speech. And I heard that even children in school have been directed to memorize that speech beginning 7 years ago. It took a good 2 years for the town of Gettysburg to really recoup. And the town has never been the same since. We have, over the years, seen many, many visitors. Many of the soldiers, once the war was over, they came back to Gettysburg. They came back and wanted to remember their comrades that had fallen on both sides. And monuments began to go up in remembrance of what had happened that day. And we, the town, we welcome them with open arms. And my descendants, to this day, welcome visitors into Gettysburg so that they will never forget the cost of that Civil War. In the end, Mr. Lincoln was assassinated. It was a very dark day. Pennsylvania loved Mr. Lincoln. The town mourned. It had lost so many of its sons, it had lost so many Pennsylvanians, and we had another loss of a president. But by and by, the little town never grew into a big city, but the little town will never be forgotten for what had occurred there. And thank you. And anybody has any questions with regards to the civilian side of Gettysburg or of the battle itself? Please open it up.
How was Lincoln
Well, Mr. Lincoln, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, the war had turned very, very well. Mr. Lincoln was in a very good mood, and he and his wife were going to attend a play at a theater that was close to the White House at the time. He was sitting in a presidential booth. Now, there was a man by the name of John Wilkes Booth, and he was pro-South. He was a Confederate supporter. He didn't like the way things were going. And Mr. Booth felt that if he had killed the president, he would be a hero to the people in the South. And he was an actor. So he snuck up in the theater. No one would question him. His face was familiar. And he shot the president in the back of the head. And he slumped over while he was watching the play with his wife. He jumped down, broke his leg, and he did make an escape, but eventually he was caught. He was actually shot on the run. The Union soldiers had caught him, and he actually died before they got him back to trial. Yes, he did go to a doctor. That's an interesting story there because he was accused of being of treason with that particular position, of betraying his country, because he treated the broken leg of Mr. Booth. But there have been attempts to clear his name, that he actually did not know that it was Booth. So some evidence is served, that may have been the truth. And then he wasn't a traitor because he did not know it was John Wilkes Booth that he was treating. Any other questions?
Right here, right here.
How many people approximately lived in Gettysburg at the time of the battle?
We were a village of about maybe 3,000. In the town itself, I would say you had about, maybe about 200 families, right in that town, and then, the outlying farms. But it was a bustling little village. You had the hotel, you had the train, you had the artisans, you had lawyers, you had, the main street was pretty full. You could shop on the streets. It was a quiet, it would have been a farm town, where you would come in for anything else you didn't need or get off the farm. But it was a nice little town.
Still is, still
It
is.
still is a beautiful town.
What was the genealogy of the people? Were they German that lived there?
Yeah, predominantly they were. They were German, and then there was a, you had German and you had English. So a lot of the folks in the town were there since, or could trace their descendants back into the Revolutionary War period, into colonial times, coming up from probably the Philadelphia area, and then settling in there because it was beautiful farm country.
Was Jenny Wade the only civilian shot?
Yes, surprisingly,
that
Jenny Wade
purposely?
was the only civilian who was killed.
Was that on purpose or just
Jenny was actually, it was an accident. I don't know how many have been to Gettysburg, but her home is there. And Jenny had come up from the cellar. She was baking bread. That's what we did. We baked bread. We had to keep busy. And we baked bread. When Jenny came up from her basement, she bent over to take her bread. And the mini ball came through her door. Where her stove was, her doorway was right here. Came in and instantaneously she was killed by the mini ball. And she was the only one. She was the only one. And we all, many of the women in the day, those that stayed behind, they were down in the basement during the course of the battle. At night it stopped, so you would come up, you tried to do what you could do. Depending on where you were, if you take a tour of Gettysburg itself, and you look along, there's brass plaques on the buildings that indicate that that home was there during the course of the battle. And if you look, it's brick. But if you look around, you're going to see the chip marks in the brick, which are from mini-ball. And a few of the buildings that are still there, if you look, you're going to see the bigger holes that are made from cannon. And I don't know if any of you, if you have an opportunity, please do see a Civil War reenactment, or any reenactment for that matter, because you get the true feel for what that was like, the noise level. You have, 5,000 muzzles going off. The sound is incredible. And then there's the smoke. These battlefields, sometimes if you see them, you might think it's fog. It's not. It's the smoke from the gunpowder. And the cannon, when the Confederates or the Union opened up, and as they did, it's just a way to do battle, it's deafening. You can't imagine standing next to that, but as you're standing in a town, and this cannonade is only maybe 2 miles away from you, it's rattling the house. And it's a very upsetting, you can only imagine what it would be like for the kids, for the women.
Are you going Saturday?
Yes, actually I am.
Yeah, I'll be down there.
That's a great time to be there because you're going to have Confederates, Union soldiers, and the civilians. So it does feel like you're stepping back.
And Abraham Lincoln will be there too. Abraham Lincoln will be there.
Yes, Mr. Lincoln will give the address. He is actually, the fellow who does Abraham Lincoln in Gettysburg is a direct descendant of the Gettys, of the founders of the town. And he does the speech. And he is absolutely excellent. You were thinking you were in the presence of Mr. Lincoln. He does a fabulous job. When you think in terms of 51,000 casualties, I think that's the greatest number of casualties in a battle to that point and since that point. It's a tremendous amount of loss, tremendous amount of loss of life. And the body, the human body, when it began to decompose, especially in the sun just, speeds that process up. So these fellas, they were black and bloated. And there were some, because some pictures have survived, where, depending on how they were laying, if they were face down, and as the body was rolled over, they looked perfectly normal. But where the sun seemed to hit them, they were black and bloated. And what you saw over those 3 days were various stages of decomposition. Because the fellas who were killed on July 1st, a lot of those fellas still laid out on that battlefield. And no one could get to them. The best that they could count on, and the fellas discussed this, soldiers discussed this before battles. They gave letters, their personal effects at times, or they told their buddy, if I don't make this, you take this. Okay? Sometimes the buddy didn't make it either.
Where all the soldiers come from? The Irish Brigade, the New York Infantry, what?
For Gettysburg, predominantly, it was Pennsylvania boys. Boys from here, the 143rd Pennsylvania Volunteers, which came out of this area, which are the boys from Carbondale all the way down the line, okay? And they're, for whatever many companies they had. But these boys, these were local boys who were there. And I believe there is a monument.
Pennsylvania Monument is there.
Well, the Pennsylvania Monument, but there's another monument where our boys, it marks the place in the battle that they were. And they were there. Many guys from, the 143rd is probably the most famous that we would hear as local people because of Delaney and DeLacy and the Medal of Honor winners. But a lot of Pennsylvanians, joined up with other because they filled their quota. Well, they wanted to fight. So they went possibly to another regiment, another number, the 98th Pennsylvania. It depended where they could join. Many of them went and joined up in New York. New York gave us the most men to fight in the Civil War. Pennsylvania comes in number 2.
Wow.
And I think really the reason is that New York itself, the city of New York, was just a whole lot bigger at that point in time than even Philadelphia was for us. It was just a big city, just more population there. But Pennsylvanians absolutely did. One of the things that strikes you when you read some of the civilian accounts of after the battle is you hear people writing about, in 61, when the war starts, everybody was up to do their duty, and they were in for about 3 months, and everybody felt the war was going to, like that, it's going to be over. Lincoln had to put out another call, and they answered, especially here, they answered. But, after Antietam and a few other battles, the honor and glory part, you walk out there and you say to yourself, this is not honor, this is not glory. If you have a loved one, you want to hang on to that, you want to believe in that because they died for a purpose. But it wasn't that, as today we would see like a Hollywood version. And these men you had to give a lot of credit to. These boys, they were miners. A lot of the Irish from Carbondale, goes down into Scranton, and they joined up in these companies and the things that they saw. And Delaney himself, who goes on to win a Medal of Honor, he was at Gettysburg. He survived Gettysburg. He was with, when Grant took over as the general commander of the Army, he was with his unit on the campaign in 1864, which is really, historians refer to that as an extremely bloody year. Grant was up against, he had to end the war, and how do you do that? North had a lot of men to supply. Grant's taken a lot of criticism for that, because he just kept dumping them in, and he just kept pursuing Lee. When they got to the Wilderness, it was the Battle of the Wilderness in Virginia, and it was not the normal battleground that they typically fought on. I don't think either side realized that this battle was going to happen. It caught Lee off guard, and I think it caught Grant and his officers off guard, because it was a thicket. Trees, bushes, tinder dry. Now, these boys meet. They can't form their usual lines. So what happens, they start firing. Well, they're shooting at each other. The fire, the cannons catch the woods on fire. So these boys are surrounded now in fire. If you're wounded, you may be alive, but you're gonna die because you're gonna burn to death, okay? Delaney is noted in that battle for charging the Confederate line, what line they could form, and he actually took their battle flag and he killed the flag bearer. And he took that flag and ran back, to his own land. It was an act of bravery. What other people, sometimes it's not told about him, is that he also drugged his comrades from those burning fires. He saved, his fellow soldiers from they were wounded, so he drugged them out of those fires. So he truly is, a heroic figure. And he's an, family of immigrants, Irish, came from Carbondale. When Lincoln called, he goes down to Scranton. He's recruited, he signs up, and the rest is history.
Carbondale Library has a nice exhibit.
Oh, yeah, and they have a nice monument, I believe, as well.
They found a soldier in 1910, I think they were tearing a barn down, and he got wounded. He had crawled underneath, and he was in a skeleton, and he had a note pen on what his name was, and then they reburied him.
Yeah. Many of the soldiers who knew they were going to die, they were wounded, and they know it was a mortal wound. So a lot of them, to try and stay safe, would try to find places where they can hide. But they would write their names, who the loved one was, and they would pin it to themselves, to the uniform, in the hopes that if the body was found, at least they could be, returned back home. The other thing you have to keep in mind, too, is what the town experienced besides, as if that wasn't enough. But as you know, if you've watched Gettysburg, the movie, if you had a wound in the leg or in the arm, medicine as it was in those days, they did their best to try and maybe go in and retract and take that mini ball out. But that wasn't the way they always wanted to go. They had to be fast. So a good surgeon in those days was a guy who could cut really fast. That was a good surgeon. If you were a soldier, you wanted a doctor or that surgeon to have the ability to just be really fast and get the limb off, and then cauterize it, and then it would be done. But outside the barns, the Kadori barn, there's a few of them there that ended up to be makeshift hospitals, to the second floor, 2 stories, piled high, with legs and arms that had been amputated over the 3 days of battle. And that also had to be dealt with and buried. Any other questions?
Anything else?
Where she put your burning bodies.
Yeah.
Such a no-no in those days.
Yeah, that was just totally unheard of. It would be sacrilegious in any of the denominations. You just can't do that. Because the belief was, at the resurrection, which was quite popular, whether it was Catholic or Protestant, was at the resurrection, everything's coming up, including the part you didn't have. That was part of you. So that would also rise with you. So they were very reluctant to do that. Mass graves were dug there. As a matter of fact, and they're still looking for it, but there is record. It got to the point where the fellows who were given the job, and they weren't paid much, to bury these soldiers, the money wasn't coming. So there was a group of Confederates. They buried the boys in blue first. Confederates were buried after that. But there was a group of Confederates, I think they were from Alabama. And Alabama gave them a run for their money, Little Round Top. That was pretty bad. And they weren't going to put them in the ground. They weren't going to put them in the ground. It took some doing. They finally got somebody to dig a mass grave somewhere there, which historians now believe is where the high school is, somewhere in that area, which is down towards the square. But there is a mass grave of Confederate soldiers who have yet to been identified. and they're unknown and in the ground, so they're trying to look for those. Worst thing the town really talks about are really the gawkers and the people coming in to take, souvenirs off the dead soldiers. Devil's Den is a group of rocks, anybody who's been there. And there was a soldier who was killed. A lot of snipers up on there. I got one of them and he fell between the rocks and he died there. The turn of the 1870s, 1880s, and people are going. They're going to visit these places, and you could see him from where he was. And people were taking, piece by piece, his fingers. Okay. Finally, they did put a stop to it. They removed him from that, and they have placed him somewhere. But that will remain a secret because he is somewhere in Devil's Den. They wanted to keep him where he was. But that's what people do. When the Park Services took over, they really needed to protect that because you had people out there digging up something terrible, especially for the bodies. Because there were, they were still finding some bodies there, 10 years after the war. So it was kind of, after a while the townspeople just didn't want to see that kind of stuff happening. And that's what prompted Wells to actually go ahead and get a cemetery. Give these boys the burial that they were doing.
Doesn't she make you feel like you're right there? I mean,
One
more question.
Nowadays, they even have special on television that Gettysburg is one of the most haunted places in the country. Do you believe that?
Well, I'll tell you what. There are stories, the Blue Boy, and if you've watched them, I'll tell you what. I am not typically someone who believes in that. However, I was in Gettysburg in the fall, had to be about 2004, and I'm walking down Steinway towards the square with Mary, my daughter, and about a block away, we see a woman coming towards us, dressed like I am. Her hair is parted down the middle. She's in sort of a drabby olive, outfit. And she's walking towards me, and I'm saying to this one, whose vision is perfect, Mary, because she was just that whole romantic Lady Belle figure as a little girl. That was great for her. So I was trying to point the woman out. So I said, can you see her? Now, there's nothing obstructing the vision. It's a clear, straight shot down the block. And she's going, what, Lady Mommy? What, Lady Mommy? I said, Mary, she's as big as life. She's right there. And she's like, no. So I turned to my husband, and I said, do you see her? He's going, no. Now I'm thinking he's just bossing me. And I'm like, yes, you do. He's like, no, I don't. Well, when you visit Gettysburg, and you come up Steinway, as you're coming up, say, towards the cemetery, on your right are two huge trees that were there during the battle. The woman, as she's walking, she then turns, goes between the trees. Now I'm thinking she's getting into a car. I watched for her to cross the street, disappear. And this was daylight. So to me, she did not get into a car. A car did not pull out. She didn't cross the street. My daughter and my husband never saw her. I seemed to be the only one to see her. When I got down to that point to where she was actually coming from the section where those buildings, those homes were there in 1863. So, maybe, I don't know. But I'd like to thank
Can
you
you
so much.
introduce your daughter to us?
Yeah, this is my daughter, Mary.
Come up here, Mary, please.
Come on up here, Mary.
The women would appreciate the outfit more than anyone else.
Yes, now, Miss Mary here has been doing this since she's 6. And she's finally graduated to long sleeves as the day. Because anything younger than this, her dress would be shorter and she would have short sleeves on. But she's pretty good. And actually her quest now is to be able to ride English side saddle in her hoops. She is a horse. Yes.
Very nice. I'm impressed. I hope everybody else is.
I just wanted to ask you, Do you know anything about that new Civil War museum that they opened in Scranton in the old police
I
station?
do, I belong to, I'm in the
Yes,
camp.
that
do
is,
too.
actually, that is the Sons of the Union Veterans facility. It was the old GAR. They had their own building and things shifted around and thankfully, they were able to go on to the building there in City Hall.
We're gonna try to have it open one Saturday a month after January for a couple hours.
Okay, very good. Thank you all very much.